gives me extraordinary joy to introduce our featured speaker for tonight, Alice Dreger. She is a bioethicist, author, and former professor of clinical medical humanities and bioethics at the Feinberg School of Northwestern University in Chicago. I think you're probably going to hear a little bit about how that former came about. I am a big fan of Alice's. I think she should also have in her description humorist, because I think she's one of the funniest people to follow on Twitter that I know of. She live tweeted her daughter's sex ed class, yeah, which was great. I highly recommend it. And it's kind of funny, by the way, Alice, when I speak and I recommend books to people, I always sort of pause before I explain the name of your book, and it's like, if this gives you any impression of the personality of Alice Dreger, her most famous recent work is called Galileo's Middle Finger, which is about academic freedom and what science is really supposed to be about. So, without further ado, Alice Dreger.
So yeah, I was that person who live tweeted her son's sex ed class a couple years ago. That was actually just after my book came out, and I'll tell you the story of how I was at that very moment being censored by Northwestern, although it was not public yet at that point. And it turned out that the day I was going to my provost to try to talk him out of the censorship and get him to admit it and get him to promise he'd never censor me again was also the day after I had gone to class and gotten in huge amounts of trouble for tweeting what was going on in my son's sex ed class. So it was pretty funny because the provost said to me, so what big controversial thing are you going to take on next? And I thought, oh, he doesn't know yet. So that was cool. It's always fun to talk to a group where I don't have to have a bodyguard, so thanks for having me. My last few talks have required bodyguards, which I always enjoy because inevitably the bodyguard does not have any knowledge in the area I'm speaking in, so listens very carefully and we have a great conversation afterwards. You'll figure out soon why, well, I don't think I should require bodyguards, but why I do. The folks at FIRE asked me to talk a little bit about my own history in terms of where I've been in both my research on what happens to people who say controversial things and get in trouble, but also what's happened to me personally. I seem to get in trouble a lot, and when I think about why that is, I think it's because my early activist work grew alligator skin on me, and once you grow, as many of you will find out as you do more of this work, once you grow alligator skin, then you don't mind sort of walking into fire or swamps or something, and so you're more apt to get in trouble. The challenge is trying to convince people you're not actually looking for it, you just happen to not be afraid of it. So I started off my work at Indiana University in the Department of History and Philosophy of Science, which is where I got my PhD. And the truth is, I had actually been a college dropout. And I'd been a very high-achieving student in high school, and I was sick of school. I was sick of people telling me what was true. And so I dropped out and became a mortgage broker on Long Island for 5 years. And at the end of it, I was finishing my degree at SUNY Old Westbury, and my therapist said, "You're cured, get out of New York." And my advisor told me that one of my friends was going off with a fellowship to do a graduate degree. And I said, "What's a fellowship?" And he said, "They pay you to read." And I said, "Oh God, I want one of those. I'm sick of mortgage brokering." So I went off to Indiana University, not realizing that the reason they admitted me was they lost my application. I found out years later, actually, that they lost my application, which is how I got into graduate school. They found it on a messy faculty member's desk 2 years later. And so I went up to graduate school, and I was and am a feminist, and I was interested in issues of gender in science. And so my dissertation director suggested I look at the history of what happened to the people who had been labeled hermaphrodites in the 19th century. That was a politically interesting time for reasons I won't go into now. In the 19th century was, the 1990s were as well, but he put me onto the topic, and so I started studying that, and as I started publishing what had happened to that population, people who had been born with the same conditions today as I was writing about from 100 years ago, contacted me and asked me to join the intersex patient rights movement. And I said at first, I do dead people, I don't do living people. Greg said I'm a bioethicist, but I'm actually a historian. I only got into ethics by accident. And so they pulled me into the movement, which was not difficult because I was raised by activists. My parents were Catholic right to life activists, so I was actually raised on abortion picket lines. And one of the reasons I've always been really interested in the freedoms of America, including free speech in particular, is because my parents were big on making sure that we understood we had democratic freedoms that my mother would not have had if she had ended up staying in Poland after the war. So it was very much instilled in me how important the freedoms of America were. When my mother came over, the Allies basically gave Poland away to the Soviet Union in order to keep the peace. And so the Soviet Union took over Poland, and part of the taking over was a totalitarian reign that greatly suppressed people's abilities to vote in any meaningful way, to have any free speech. And so when I was growing up, my relatives were jumping ship, coming over, and it was very clear to me that the reason they were coming was not because of money and not even because of safety at some level, it was because of political freedom. And so it was really clear to me going into graduate school that I had an interest in making sure that I thought clearly about justice issues. So I became what I suppose today is called a social justice warrior, although I don't particularly like social justice warriors. I still consider myself an activist. And I joined the patients' rights movement for intersex rights, and I've been working in that area for 20 years. I worked on changing the medical establishment's approach to intersex, and I won't tell you all the things that are wrong with it, but the basic stuff that was wrong was children who were born this way with bodies that were different from the usual male or the usual female, were being treated in ways that no other human were being treated. For example, being lied to about their medical records, having their genitals changed simply because they didn't fit social norms, although that happens with circumcision. So about 10 years into that work, in about 2005, 2006, I thought it was time to back off and retire. I had a kid at that point. I'd actually had been working at Michigan State University then for about 6 years, had tenure, and decided to give up tenure because I was interested in doing writing and speaking and activism. And it was too hard to have a full-time academic job and a kid and do all of that. So I quit my job and gave up tenure. And some friends of mine at Northwestern University offered me a small part-time job in the medical humanities and bioethics program because I had a big name. And I said, sure, you give me money, you can have my name, I'll have your collegiality, this will be great. So I did that. And I decided as a sort of palate cleanser to do a history of a controversy in transgender. Transgender is different from intersex. Intersex is about being born with a body type that's different. Transgender is about feeling that the gender assignment given to you at birth is the wrong one, and that you need to take on a different one publicly. And so, as I always tell people, intersex and transgender people have the opposite problems historically for the same reason. Intersex people were getting surgeries they didn't want. Transgender people often couldn't get access to the medical interventions they did want, both because of a heterosexist medical system that was controlling who gets to be what. So I took on this controversy, and I took it on for a reason that now strikes me as kind of funny because it was a free speech issue. What had happened was I'd been introduced to a controversial researcher named Mike Bailey at Northwestern University. He was a psychology researcher. You may know him from the Foxsaw incident of a couple years ago. But Mike was, at the time, he had written a book a few years earlier called The Man Who Would Be Queen, which was looking at what he called feminine males. And one of the things he looked at was men who transitioned to become women and the reasons for it. And he was putting forth a very controversial idea, which was the idea that gender transition wasn't just about gender identity, it was also about eroticism and sexual orientation. And this is a no-no among the transgender rights movement because it's an eroticization of something that in the popular mind is supposed to be just all about gender. And I knew what had happened to him was a lot of people had come after him. In particular, 3 particular transgender activist women had come after him and had made very strong accusations against him, things that would have ruined his career. Charges like that he had made up research, that he had done human subjects research without the proper ethics oversight, that he had slept with a transsexual research subject when she was his research subject, that he'd been practicing clinical psychology without a license. And what happened was a few months after we had met, one of the people who had come after him was invited to Northwestern's campus to speak, a woman named Andrea James. And Mike wrote to me and I said, I can't believe they've invited her. And I said, I never really did follow your controversy. Who is she? And he sent me a PDF showing me what she had done during the controversy. He had taken photographs of his children, who were minors in the photographs, and had put them up online with their eyes blacked out so you could still tell who they were, especially since she used their names, and basically used a parody of what she thought the book said to suggest that they had been perhaps sodomized by their father. So she had specifically gone after Mike Bailey's kids, and I thought this was just disgusting and wrong, that even if there had been a point against Bailey, that going after people's children and putting up pictures of them and making sexual comments about your children online was out of line. So I wrote to the Northwestern Rainbow Alliance that had invited her, and I said to them that I didn't think she was a good choice of invitation. I did not attempt a disinvitation, but what I did say was I thought she was a poor choice, because I thought she was bad for transgender rights as well as bad for an academic environment. And I made that public, and she came after me rather intensely all of a sudden. I thought, well, this is fascinating. And then a whole bunch of people wrote to me to try to tell me what I should believe about this controversy. And I'm always fascinated when a million people are telling me to believe a million different things. So I decided to do a history of that controversy, which I spent a year doing. And the deeper into it I got, the more I realized that what I was looking at was not a he said, she said argument. It was a case in which Bailey had been accused falsely, probably knowingly accused falsely by his detractors, because he was putting forth an idea they didn't like, because he was putting forth an idea they found threatening. So I knew that when I went to publish that work that they would probably come after me. Now, mind you, they had gone after him with everything they had. They had tried to get him fired at Northwestern. They had frequented bars that he had gone to try to find out information about him. They had changed his online identity to a large extent. They had harassed his family, his girlfriend, his colleagues. They had tried to get him disinvited at various places. They had tried to get him censored by the Illinois Department of Professional Psychology for supposedly practicing psychology without a license, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It was very ugly. So I knew that when I published my work, they would probably come after me, which is exactly what they did. And this was an extremely disorienting experience, because there I had been a champion of intersex rights, one of the leaders in the LGBT rights movement to some degree, because intersex had gotten swept in. And all of a sudden, this was 2007, 2008, when Google's algorithms were easier to manipulate. All of a sudden, my entire online identity morphed. I went from being a person who was an advocate for sexual minorities to being supposedly somebody who wanted to put intersex people in the gas chambers. I was supposedly a tool of the Catholic Church, which amused me since I'm an atheist. It said things about me that were absolutely false, but it all looked so real. And so it was a very disorienting experience. They also, one of the people who was angry at me decided to file with Northwestern an ethics charge against me because I had made a joke in my article about having sex with a research subject, namely about my husband. I said that if everybody we write about is a research subject, and you're never supposed to have sex with a research subject, then I had violated that by having sex with my husband, since I sometimes write about him. And so I had joked about this, and so this person tried to file ethics charges against me for supposedly believing that sex with research subjects is okay, which I do think it's okay in some circumstances. And then when the school newspaper did an article on this, my husband decided to post a comment saying that he was the subject of both the sex and the research, and both were excellent. He was a professor of medicine at Michigan State, and this led to him having an ethics charge filed against him because he had supposedly joked about sex with research subjects. I said to him, I think we are the only couple in history ever accused of violating ethics because we had sex with each other while married. We are still married. Somehow through all this, we are still married. So it went on, and what happened was Steve Pinker, who was implicated in the Bailey controversy because he had blurred Bailey's book, said to me, I love your writing and this research is amazing, and would you like an introduction to my agent? And I said, no, they're ruining my reputation. What I really need is a Guggenheim Fellowship to save myself. And I was afraid Northwestern would also fire me. It would have been easy to do so as a one-year position. I didn't really need the job, but I didn't want to be publicly humiliated. And so Pinker and a couple other people helped me get a Guggenheim Fellowship. I'm probably the only person ever recommended for a Guggenheim by Steven Pinker and Dan Savage, but that worked out really well. And I took the money and traveled the country talking to other researchers who had been beset upon by identity politics activists, trying to understand what had happened to them and how they had survived it. And the book Galileo's Middle Finger recounts those stories of meeting those people and telling their stories of what had happened to them. And at various points along the way, what happened was when I saw a mess that hadn't been sorted out, that seemed to me to need sorting out, I paused and tried to help sort it out. So I ended up getting embroiled in lots of stuff, including the case of Napoleon Chagnon, who was investigated for 2 years by the American Anthropological Association for supposedly treating the Yanomama people in a way that was supposedly unethical. Napoleon Chagnon is a very famous anthropologist, and he and James Neal were accused by a journalist, a self-styled journalist, of having purposely carried out an act of genocide against the Yanomami people in 1968. And it had already been sorted out that this was not true, but the American Anthropological Association decided to go after Chagnon for 2 years anyway, and I was trying to figure out why they had done that, and I did enough digging to finally get the evidence in writing that the reason they did it was not because they thought the charges were real. In fact, they knew the charges were false. They felt that they had to prove that they cared about indigenous people, so they were willing to string him up in order to prove that. And the more I worked on this, the more horrified I became about what the left, myself included, is capable of in terms of academic stuff. That the ways in which the university system, which had formed a protection for people like me who were working for social justice, also allowed people who were working for social justice to make completely false claims in order to support their cause. And at the end of the day, what was clear to me was that if we had to care about anything in academia, it was not justice, it was truth. Because there are other systems to deal with justice, but there is no other place in this country, really, that can deal with basic truths. Yes, we have justice systems that try to ferret out the truth. We have research scientists who work outside of the universities. But the universities are the only place where people can be reasonably safe and independent enough to actually do the kind of work that tells us what's true about the world. And you can't have social justice if it's based on false reality. You can't know, for example, how to prevent rape and how to support the victims of rape if what you believe to be true about where rape comes from is wrong. So one of the cases I looked at in the book was the case of when Randy Thornhill and Craig Palmer, two scientists, published a book called A Natural History of Rape, which argued that in some circumstances there are biological bases to sexual coercion and rape in humans and other animals. And they were doing this as a corrective to the standard feminist narrative, which says that rape is primarily about power. The feminist narrative has been extremely useful, extremely powerful, because basically what it's done is allowed people who are victims of rape to have some rights that they did not have before. But it's gone so far that people in courts were arguing that if you couldn't prove a power need between, say, a man who raped a woman, if he didn't have some need for power over her, then the sex could not have been a rape, because rape is about power. So Craig Palmer told me the very intense story of how he even came to this subject. He was in graduate school studying anthropology at Arizona, and he told me that postmodernism was moving in, and everybody was saying, well, one narrative is the same as another narrative, and our job is just to record the narratives and put the narrative. And he felt like, what's the point of that? That's not science. So he quit and became a lobster fisherman in Maine. He left graduate school and gave up his PhD work. And what happened was he got a call from a district attorney back in Arizona asking him about a case where a girl was kidnapped, raped, and murdered. And the district attorney was asking him questions about whether or not he knew of any relationship between the guy they were sure did it and the girl. And Craig couldn't understand this. He was like, why do you have to show any relationship? Isn't it possible this was just an opportunistic kidnapping and rape and murder, the murder being to cover up the rape? And the district attorney said that when they went to court and tried to claim that sort of thing, that this was an opportunistic crime, that what the defense would say is, no, rape is about power, it's not about sex, and so you have to prove some power relationship between the guy and the girl. And so Craig was horrified that women might be basically used as victims and then there would be no justice in this system if this was the narrative. So he went back to graduate school and paid the bills in lobsters, and ended up finishing his PhD working on this topic. So you can't really have a good, solid social justice system. We can't have decent social policy if we don't know what's true about the world. And sometimes what's true about the world is not what we think it is, or what we expect it to be, or what we want to hear. And there really isn't any other place in America where we have the potential to have genuinely independent researchers who might be able to tell us stuff we don't want to hear or stuff we didn't expect. That's why we need them around. So you're going to be talking tomorrow, and I know Greg already talked about the terrible importance of free speech on university campuses. But I want to couple that to what we talk about more broadly with regard to academic freedom. That it's not just freedom of speech, freedom of what we say. What's really important and being lost in America today is the ability to do research in ways that are challenging and the ability to teach in ways that are challenging. So that may sound like speech, but it's not just speech. It has to do with even more in terms of being able to get the resources we need to do the work that we want to do. So I mentioned that I resigned from Northwestern. I did most of the work in Galileo's middle finger while I was I did all of it while at Northwestern except for the early intersex work. And at Northwestern, I was very much protected under academic freedom, even though I was on a simple one-year position that they could have gotten rid of me very easily without any discussion. When I came to Northwestern, there was a Holocaust denier on faculty, an electrical engineer who somehow thinks he's an expert on the Holocaust, a guy named Butts, appropriately. Professor Butts would every now and then rise up and talk about how the Holocaust was a myth that the Jews made up and it didn't really happen. And when this would occur, our provost would write to us and he would say, this guy's wrong, he's not got the facts right, it's not true what he's saying, and I will defend his right to say it. And every time I got what we thought of as the Butts letter from the provost, I thought, I love working here. Because no matter what I do, these people are going to protect me if what I'm doing is important to me. And that was true. But that changed a couple years before I resigned at Northwestern. What happened was, for monetary reasons, the university decided to basically sell the faculty practice of the medical school, and I worked in the medical school, to sell the faculty practice to the hospital corporation. And when they did that, they apparently made some deals that interfered with my academic freedom, although I didn't know it at the time. My department put out a magazine/journal called Atrium, and it was short essays in medical humanities and bioethics. So these were pieces written by doctors and patients and scholars and nurses and journalists about different themes. And in 2013, I was asked to do the next issue. And the theme that we settled on was the theme of bad girls. And the reason for that theme was I do feminist work, I work in issues of sex, and so we thought the concept of bad girls would be a good, cool theme for people to work on. So we put a proposal, call for proposals together, sent it out, got about 35 responses, and out of those I chose 13. And the one that got me in trouble was a piece written by Bill Peace, who's a cultural anthropologist at Syracuse University. Bill wrote about his own personal experience, although he's also writing as a scholar in disability studies. And he wrote about when he was 18 years old and spinal cord injured from a neurological condition. He became paralyzed from the waist down. This was in 1978. And in the late 70s, it's the sexual revolution, so a lot of sex and drugs going on culturally out in the open. But in addition to that, it was the first time where we had really long-term rehabilitation hospitals where they were rehabbing men to send them back out into the world. And so it was in one of these hospitals. This is long-term, basically almost like a home facility where they're doing long-term rehab. And he's 18 years old, right? He kept asking the doctors, am I going to be able to have sex? Because sex is important. But the doctors couldn't or wouldn't answer his question. So he tells the story of how a nurse that he became emotionally close with one night recognized that this was troubling him because he was sort of working on his penis trying to see if he could get an erection. He had just lost bladder control. And she decided to provide him consensually oral sex in order to assure him that he would be able to have an erection and able to have an ejaculation and someday be able to have kids, which was very important to him. And she was right. He had a son years later. And so he wrote up this story for me, and it was a very moving story to me, a story of compassion, not something we would promote, and he was not promoting sex relationships in hospitals today. He made that clear. He called it the Wild West of rehabilitation medicine. But what he was saying was, are we today dealing with the reality of the needs, the sexual needs of people with disabilities, especially new disabilities? Well, apparently my dean got a hold of the Bad Girls issue one night after the 3,000 copies had been mailed out and it had been put up online like all of our issues. And he decided that this article, which by the way had the wonderful title Head Nurse, it also had an awesome graphic, which probably got me much more in trouble. It was a graphic from a sex and disability website. You know the standard picture in the parking lots for the disabled parking, right, is of a person in a wheelchair. This was of a guy leaning slightly back and a woman with her head in his lap. It was a great image. It was a perfect cartoon image to go with the piece that was very much about empowerment for both parties. So the dean decided that this apparently violated a branding agreement with the hospital. And so because it was violating a branding agreement, it was pulled offline. They couldn't pull back the paper copies. People have sometimes said to me, oh, it wasn't really censorship. And I say to them, this is the definition of censorship when something is published and then withdrawn by somebody else. So it was pulled offline, and I was told, Alice, shut up, don't say anything. We're going to try to work this out. I was, meanwhile, finishing the page proofs to Galileo's Middle Finger. I was literally finishing this major book on academic freedom, which had blurbs already on the cover from Steven Pinker and Jared Diamond and E.O. Wilson, and Dan Savage, and it was clear to me this was going to be a big important book telling people to stand up for your academic freedom, and I was being censored, and how could I stay quiet? But I was really afraid for my colleagues' jobs, and so I tried really hard to fix it internally for a long time, for 15 months actually, and towards the end called fire. Bill and I finally went to the university and said, we're not going to put up with the censorship anymore, we're going public. At that point they said, oh, okay, then put it back up online, because they were afraid. The much more disturbing thing than the censorship of that particular article was that they decided for the whole journal to institute a new editorial committee, which consisted of representatives from the dean's office and the PR department to tell us what we were and were not allowed to publish in a journal. And I could not put up with this. One of my colleagues who had also published in the same issue about women and sexuality and disability, Christy Kirshner, who's a physician who works on disability studies issues, resigned over this censorship. And I finally did as well. I went to Northwestern and I told them I wanted them to acknowledge that censorship had occurred and to promise me it would not occur again. And if you know who Jeff Stone is, he works with FIRE and was an advisor to me during the censorship period. He kept saying to me, they're going to come around, Alice. They're going to come around. Northwestern couldn't possibly go and do this. They cannot do this if they know you're going to go public. But it became clear they would. And so I finally did resign and make it public. And they have not yet apologized, although the FIRE folks tell me they're still trying to get an apology out of them. And that was, by the way, while the Kipnis stuff was going on at the same time, under the same administration, basically. So it's been a kind of wacky adventure. That all happened essentially late enough that it's now in the afterword to the paperback edition, but it didn't make it, of course, into the hardback edition. My husband likes to say I'm trying to see if you, I'm running an N of 1 experiment to see if you can die of too much irony. And I sometimes think I will die of too much irony. So just to bring this home, what I want to tell you is that academic freedom is under assault from 3 different directions, and that makes it particularly vulnerable. The one direction is the left, and you're familiar with that because that happens to be very vocal and visible on campus. That's the sort of stuff we talk about all the time with regard to people feeling that they don't want speech that they find offensive. But in addition to that, it's under attack from the right as well. What we're seeing, particularly with people who are extremely rich and also Republican legislatures around the country, is attempts to shut down programs that they don't like. So, for example, at the University of North Carolina, Gene Nichols' program, which is a center for the study of poverty, was shut down essentially by the Republican North Carolina legislature. In Wisconsin, Governor Scott Walker has managed to basically kill tenure as we've known it at the University of Wisconsin because he wants to be able to basically get rid of entire departments that he finds politically unpalatable. So we're seeing that as well. So we got the right and the left, but in addition to that, we have what happened to me, which is the corporatization problem. The problem where universities are now being run not by people who rose up in their ranks as academics, but by typically business people who are hired from the outside and who think like business people. These are people who want to think about risk management and reduce any possibility that anybody's going to sue about anything. And in addition to that, they're obsessed with brands. So they're absolutely obsessed with the question of how to keep everybody on brand. Well, you know what? Brands are about messages. And at the end of the day, academic freedom can never be about a single message. So academic freedom and branding are the exact opposite of each other. They cannot coexist. And yet they are trying to coexist in universities, and what's happening is the message to the faculty that they better not be troublemakers, because troublemakers are disruptive to the system. They tend to get in the way of donors coming to us, they get in the way of government funding. So what we're losing is we're losing the ability to search for the truth. And what I try to tell people who work on justice issues at academia is, if you care about justice, you have to care about the search for truth too. You can't so care about your justice cause that you shut down people who are trying to find out the truth. But the same is true for those people, the scientists I talk to, who think they don't care about justice issues. They think they just want to work on the truth. I tell them, you better start caring about the justice issues, because academic freedom, at the end of the day, free speech is a justice issue. And if there is not a just system here where you have due process when people accuse you of things, then you're not going to be able to search for the truth. The search for the truth and the search for justice have coexisted in America for hundreds of years, since the beginning. A lot of people don't know this, but it's nice that we're in Philadelphia. A lot of the founding fathers were science geeks, and that was not a coincidence. Both modern science and modern democracy grew out of the same system, which was the Enlightenment. And both were interested in the idea, believed in the idea that more minds on one idea would get you better results. That's why we have a voting system, because it's more minds looking at a single question. That's why we have a jury system. That's why we have a Supreme Court. That's why we have 3 branches of government. And in the sciences, that's why we have peer review. That's why we have publication. That's why we're constantly trying to replicate and look at each other's work. Both of those things came out of the Enlightenment, and they came out of the idea that a single individual can never really know the truth about something. You need multiple individuals to do that. But the last place where this sort of work is possible, academia, is under attack from 3 different sides. So I know you all are going to go out and work a lot on issues of free speech for students, but one of the things I want to beg of you is that you pay attention to what's happening to your professors. Because what's happening to them is that they're beginning to live in places that are climates of fear. They're afraid of how to teach and how to research in ways that won't get them in trouble. If you have people who are afraid of getting in trouble, you know what you get? The same old stuff over and over again. You never get anything new, and you don't get anything challenging. I look back 20 years at what I was teaching at Michigan State. It would get me in so much trouble now, which seems really weird that 20 years later I would get in trouble for the stuff I was doing then. For example, I decided at my program, which was a science undergraduate program at Michigan State, to start teaching a course on sex and gender, which was very radical. Nobody was teaching sex and gender in the science courses at that time, and not in that program. And so I started teaching it, and the new sexual harassment policy came out. And I read the sexual harassment policy, and I took my syllabus, and I matched up all the places in which my syllabus violated the policy. Things like, you're not allowed to show pictures of genitals. I was like, I'm teaching genital development. How am I not going to show pictures of genitals? You're not allowed to ask students to think about their sexual histories. I wasn't going to ask them to write or speak about it, but it was inevitable they were going to end up thinking about their sexual histories in the course. So I went to my director of the program and I said, here's my syllabus and here's all the places. I've marked down which part of the code it violates in all these places. I just want you to know. And he went, okay. He was great. I did things like get up on a lab bench to demonstrate the difference between birth in the squatting position and birth in the lithotomy position, with a skirt on now that I think about it, but I think I was facing the board. And I realized later that day I was being evaluated for my teaching that day. I totally forgot when I got up on the lab bench and demonstrated how to birth in the squatting position versus the lithotomy position that I was being evaluated. So many things I did in my classes then, made jokes, dared to make jokes about sex, would get me in trouble today. So why is this? And what's happening to your education when your professors are afraid to say challenging things, to ask you to think challenging things? You're getting a shitty education, to be honest. You're getting an education that you might as well just sit home and read. It's the exact kind of education, honestly, that made me drop out of college. It was the sort of thing where the same old books teaching the same old stuff was being taught to me in the same old way at Georgetown University, and I was tired of it. I wanted teachers who were going to make my brain hurt. And at SUNY Old Westbury, that's actually what I got. That's where we should go. So think about the ways that you can help your faculty feel safe enough to do things that are daring. And part of that has to be thinking about the ways in which your student government can assist with things like passing the Chicago Principles. Teaming up between your student government and your faculty government. What's happened over the years is administrations have done a very clever thing. They have not rewarded people for doing academic governance. They've rewarded them for bringing in external money, mostly, and for doing publications, but mostly for bringing in external money. The consequence is the best and the brightest on the faculty have dropped out of academic governance. And who do we have doing academic governance at many universities? Well-meaning, sleepy, older professors. What we need is a reinvigoration of academic governance where the faculty take back control of policies and control of the way things work at the university. Until we have that, what we're going to have is the corporatites deciding what we're allowed to do and how we're going to get in trouble. And that's a dangerous situation for knowledge and ultimately a dangerous situation for justice. The last thing I want to tell you is that if you think you're in this movement because you want to bash feminists, or you want to bash Catholics, or you want to bash Mormons, or you want to bash whoever it is, you're in the wrong movement. This movement is about the principle of being able to say what you need to say, research what you need to research, teach what you need to teach, in a way that is not obnoxious, hopefully, but that sometimes will make people uncomfortable. That's what we do. Unfortunately, defending this principle often means you spend a lot of your time defending assholes. I spend a lot of my time defending assholes. I would rather people didn't do the approach that way, but sometimes they do. But what's important is for you to recognize that you're not in this movement to be allied with a particular political faction or against a particular political faction. If you are serious about working on free speech, you're going to have to align yourself with people who make you uncomfortable. And that's good. When you're uncomfortable, it's a sign you're in a place where there's potential for growth. As one of my best professors said to me in graduate school, if you haven't changed your mind lately, how do you know it's working? And that's what I would say to you. Be aware of whether or not your mind is changing. It can often be uncomfortable doing this work. I don't think the fact that it's uncomfortable is a badge of honor. It's just one of the side effects of it. But at the end of the day, the place where you have to be is in your own bed sleeping with yourself, and you have to be able to sleep with yourself. You have to figure out, do you have integrity at the end of the day? Did you do things well? When you don't, it makes sense to apologize. I spend part of my time apologizing. It's still hard for me to do it because I have a big ego, but I do it because it's part of learning how I got things wrong and having people respect me. But you also have to get up in the morning and recognize that there are going to be challenges to your principles. And it's going to be easy to think, oh, you know which side you're on. It's sometimes not that easy. You got to step back and think about it. I'm proud of you all for doing this work. This is the work my mother's relatives jumped ship for. Thank you.
Hey, so thank you very much, first of all. I know that one of the things you've talked about in interviews around the Northwestern situation was that it was easier for you to take a principled stand because you knew that your husband still had steady employment coming in, and so it was easier for you to resign. And I know also in Greg's talk earlier, he said he kind of was working from the comfort, well, not comfort, but understanding that people, if they got in trouble, could find other jobs. So I'm just curious if you have any wisdom or advice to those of us who feel maybe more vulnerable and have maybe don't have such an easy time speaking out about stuff, like in the sense that maybe you couldn't find another job if you stick to your principles or something like that.
Yeah, and it was definitely something I took into account when I was trying to protect my colleagues. Was not all of them were in the position I was, which was the job was not paying me that much, and I had other economic sources. My writing, my speaking actually paid better than my Northwestern job, and on top of that, my husband's a physician and an administrator, ironically. Believe me, of all the times in my life that have been hard, it's when he became an administrator and I was suddenly sleeping with an administrator. He's the dean of the medical school at Michigan State right now. He joked when I pissed off my dean, he's like, married to one, pissing off another, you're living the dream, baby. So it was awkward when they were at conferences together. One of the things that I think does help is trying to think about how much money you do need to live, because my husband and I have made a lot of decisions that have forfeited money. So for example, when I quit my job at Michigan State, I've given up, now it comes to about $1 million of income that I gave up. And one of the reasons we did that was to have a better family life. But we also did it because he felt and I felt that the life I could lead, and by extension the life he could lead, would be so much better if I was not trying to juggle a traditional academic job on top of everything else I was interested in doing. So one of the things I would say to you is money is not that important if you recognize the basic stuff that you need to live. So we drive much cheaper cars than people of our positions normally would drive. We have a house that's not worth very much money. We're telling our kid he's going to a state school because we've made economic decisions in order to have our principles. And that may sound terribly principled, but like I said, at the end of the day, when you go to sleep ultimately with yourself. And so if you can feel decent about the choices you made, it's just so much better. But I do recommend falling in love with a doctor and then not pissing him off. It's a good strategy. People say if you do what you love, somebody will pay you enough to do it. It's sort of true, but Obamacare is not that cheap. So.
Okay. Hi, my name is Gabrielle. In my current internship, I'm actually studying a subject I knew nothing about, even though I was in some gender classes, where I'm studying transsexuality in Iran. And one thing most alarming that I learned is that they're the second highest in sex change operations besides Thailand in the world. And as I'm researching it, I'm learning more about how people who are gay are sometimes given the wrong information that they're transgender instead of that they are homosexual because of the repercussions of being homosexual, for instance, in Iran. But what I found most striking was that at my campus and maybe others, there really is no attention given to gender issues internationally, more just ones that people say are going on nationally, which definitely has credit also. But I was just wondering your feelings if academia is kind of ignoring more or not giving as much attention to international issues with gender from what you've noticed in your study of your colleagues.
Yeah, it's definitely true that there's not enough attention paid, certainly to global experiences of gender and sexuality. And when you do start looking globally, you find really interesting patterns. So I've published, for example, for the Atlantic and Pacific Standard, a bunch of essays about stuff anthropologists and psychologists have found internationally. Part of what happens in this country is that psychologists tend to use the population that's available to them. And the population that's available to them is what they call the weird population: white, educated, industrial, something, and rich and democratic. It's not a normal population compared to the rest of the world, and we end up getting information from that group and thinking that that's true about the human experience. What's happened in this country is something very strange in the last couple of years. There's been a real move towards what's called essentialism in LGBT life, and that's the idea that I was absolutely born this way, and that's the way I am, and nothing would ever change it, period, period, period. And straight people tend to believe that as well about themselves, that people think it's all very stable. If we look cross-culturally, in fact, what we find is that there are different cultural opportunities available to people, and we probably are born with particular leanings one way or another, but given different cultural situations, we'll end up tracking you in different ways. So there are places in the world, for example, where men who in this country would grow up to be gay men do grow up to be transgender women, not because they're coerced as they are in Iran. In Iran, they're coerced. But in places like Samoa, where they're not coerced, growing up to be a transgender woman simply makes more sense in that culture. And there's a part in Mexico where that occurs. There's some places in South America where that occurs. And so it seems to be one of the variations that occurs from the natural variation of sexual orientation existing in the world. It's always a good idea to look beyond your own culture.
Hi.
Hi.
Can I hold it? Sorry, I feel weird like talking into your hand. Okay. So you brought up a really good point about the movement against academic censorship, how it's not about being for or against a certain party or a certain political idea. It's about supporting what needs to be said in the interest of justice and truth. But the problem that I find is that things that need to be said in the interest of justice and truth at my school are not being said because this movement toward academic censorship tends to have an inherently liberal focus. For example, in liberal academia, you find a tremendous amount of focus on very important issues of feminism, and those definitely have a place in a good education. But my school has a minor program called Gender Studies, and the classes in the Gender Studies minor are women in art, women in literature, women throughout history, and female biology, and nothing about men. And I don't think you can have a minor called Gender Studies and not discuss issues impacting an entire gender, like paternity rights or disproportionate suicide rates, circumcision, disproportionate incarceration. So how do you balance a need to focus on neutrality to make sure your movement holds on to integrity while knowing that your opposition is inherently aligned with a certain political side?
I think you can do both. So in my own circumstances, for example, I've never given up working on intersex rights while at the same time I'm working on academic freedom, right? So I think it's possible for me to argue that the people arguing against me should have the same freedoms I do, and to try to to push that at the same time I'm working on a particular political agenda. I agree with you that it's often the case that because academia skews very hard to the left, that we end up not looking at all of the things we should be looking at and not engaging all the questions we should. And that's going to have to be one of the things that we diversify on. And I'm starting to tell people in academia on the left, if you don't want the Republicans coming down and shutting down tenure and shutting down your programs, maybe we should have more Republicans in our midst who might defend tenure in our systems if they saw the same things happening from within, right? Plus, I think it's just good for us to have political diversity within universities. You could ask for courses like that, and there should be people qualified to teach courses like that, and if the response is men don't matter, then I think that's, you know, something to engage, because obviously men do matter. And I believed that even before I had a son, that men do matter.
I was wondering, with all the people here, we've certainly got people at our own colleges or universities who are unable or unwilling to step up to censorship in their fields of study. What can we do as people that are involved in student government or student media to help them, or to make that environment better for them?
Yeah, I think one of the things that you can do is try to engage. It took me a long time to realize how important one-on-one conversations are. So it was stupid, but it took me years into the intersex rights movement before I realized I was not going to change the medical system by publishing another article. I was going to change the medical system by going to the city where this particular surgeon was and sitting down and having a beer together. That was actually going to make more difference than my publishing another stupid article. And that turns out to be true. So I think sitting down with people, especially, I mean, this sounds weird, but especially over food actually helps. Anthropologists have sort of shown this, the importance of breaking of bread literally with people that you're trying to meet at a one-on-one level. And having a conversation, asking them genuinely, so what do you feel like you could say that would be controversial enough that somebody might say, you're not allowed to say that? And ask them to think about the kinds of stuff that might be censored in their case. And then also, I think, trying to get more education about the history of censorship. Greg talked a little bit about it, but it's remarkable to me, for example, that my son, who's in high school now, he's going into his junior year. Last year, when they were studying the history of the US, they spent about 3 minutes on McCarthy, right? Whereas I would have spent at least a day on blacklisting and censorship and the anti-communist movement and the hysteria that occurred in this country. Because unless you can recognize that this is in our midst, then I think people have a very glib attitude towards it. And if they haven't had somebody in their family who's come from a country where they didn't have these rights, then they don't have this sort of gut level sense of just how delicate these rights are. So if at all possible, engaging people and asking them, I'm curious, what kinds of things do you think you might put out there that somebody might say to you, you're not allowed to say that, or I don't want to hear that, and begin to get them to think about the principles and engage with the principles. I think that that can really help. But a lot of this is one-on-one work. I think it's also really important that you try to engage your administration. So try to get a couple students together and get your deans or your provost or whoever it is to go out with you. And they'll usually do this because they'll realize you're going to be alumni someday and they want your money. So get them to go, they do. Get them to go out with you and spend some time talking to them, telling them, this is an issue I'm really passionate about. Passionate enough about that I went to a conference on it, because I think it's really important that we be a place where people can say what they need to say, research what they need to research, and teach what they need to teach.
What advice do you have for young people who are interested in going to academia, going into research, being professors, but are scared of spending their whole lives like desperately seeking tenure and getting fired and just kind of flopping out?
Don't do it if you're scared. Do it because the reason you do it, so as a job in general, it's hard and it doesn't pay very well. If you're a smart person, you can make more money elsewhere. The reason to do it is because you love what it involves, which is the pursuit of knowledge and the teaching. And if you love that stuff, then you can get by and put up with the crap and put up with the low pay that's involved in many of the jobs. But I think it is important that we move towards unionization in this country in terms of faculty. Right now, the tenured faculty are largely living off of the people who are adjuncts. The adjunct faculty, understandably, are growing ever more resentful of the tenured faculty and not helping the tenured faculty when they're under threat, because their attitude is, well, you're the rich people with a lovely tenure, why don't you help yourselves, right? So there's a civil war starting to break out between the people who are on non-tenure lines and the people who are on tenure lines. Let me just give you one more example of how important academic freedom is. It's kind of funny, and how you don't actually need tenure. to do good work, because like almost all of my challenging work has been done outside of tenure. That's why people say to me, tenure is so important. I say tenure is absolutely important, and you don't have to have it to do challenging work. But my husband, because he's the dean of the medical school at Michigan State University, is the dean of the chief whistleblower in the Flint water crisis. And if you think about the situation he is in, he's in a situation where his faculty member, Mona Hana Atish, is whistleblowing on the governor who pays for his medical school, right? So that, and they've gotten away with it so far, right? What that tells us is that when you look at something like the Flint water crisis, where did the knowledgeable, most effective whistleblowers come from? The activists were really important and did huge amounts of important work and should not be discounted at all, the on-the-ground activists. But what finally broke through the system and forced the government to admit that they were lying about the water in Flint was two academic researchers, one at Virginia Tech and one at Michigan State, both land-grant universities dedicated to serving the people. Neither of them had tenure, but they both had the protections of academic freedom to be able to do something that directly challenged the governmental claims. So many cases, checks and balances that don't otherwise work when academics manage to do work that pushes the truth. For example, the innocence projects that exist around the country at academic universities are very important. A lot of the journalism programs that are being gutted right now are terribly important. So there's so many places where that kind of work can be done. And if you care about that kind of work, if you care about doing that sort of heavy pushing work, then you do it even though it doesn't pay well and even though it's scary and uncertain.
Hi, I'm Chris. You gave a forceful and rousing defense of the Enlightenment values, which is, sort of like the intellectual underpinning of Western civilization, but much of the, assault on academic freedom from the identity politics left is born out of an assault on Western civilization. I mean,
it's a distaste for Western civilization.
How do you contend that the search for truth is what academics ought to be involved with people who dispute that there is an objective truth, or who dispute these sort of fundamental notions? Because it seems there's sort of an irreconcilable difference.
I'm a freak in the humanities, but I'm not for a historian. So historians are the people in the humanities who probably should be in the sciences, because we're really obsessed with data. We're really obsessed with knowing what exactly is true. I do think there's a place for the humanities, but I don't think there's a place for making shit up and not paying attention to information. And so Greg talked about Ward Churchill. I would absolutely to the death defend Ward Churchill's right to say incredibly obnoxious, politically incorrect things. The reason I dislike Ward Churchill is a beautiful investigation done by a team at Colorado that basically showed that in his scholarship he was making shit up. And that I have no tolerance for. That I have absolutely no tolerance for, and I think people who do that should be driven out of the academy. So I think one of the things we have to have is a renewed, open conversation about the importance of data seeking and the importance of talking about facts. And that doesn't happen in a lot of universities, because I think the scientists often just look at the humanities people and say, oh, they're kind of hopeless, and the humanities people saying, that's your story and this is our story, and we have to have more of a conversation about that. And we're not having that right now, but we need to have that. There's a huge value to the humanities, and I won't get into it right now. It absolutely needs to exist within universities, but people do have to care about facts.
So you mentioned the Chicago principles as something that students could organize around in terms of trying to really push their universities and colleges to make really concrete changes. But one of the other things you brought up in terms of the extensive growth of administrations and the increased business ethic of administrators, that seems like a particularly thornier issue to really push against, because it's so comprehensive and really can't be dealt with, by a single policy change. Have you, in your experience, found any way in particular that is really effective to push back against administrative overgrowth and the increased business orientation of it? Or is it just something that seems so pervasive that it's hard to really pinpoint a particular area to go
It is really difficult, but I think one of the places that we can push back is taking back control of policy and procedures in university systems. And so doing things like pushing for the Chicago principles, even if the administration says they're not going to really have any teeth in it, still pushing for it, I think, makes a big difference. It is very difficult, though. It's a very difficult problem, right? Because and I've seen this at my own dining room table as my husband works at night. the administration decides where the money will go, so the administration will always have enough money. That's how it works, right? When my husband's job grows a little bit out of control in terms of there's a new project they've taken on and it's causing a huge amount of work, what does he do? He hires another person. When I have a research project going on and it's become a really big research project and very complicated, I don't get to just hire another person. I have to go to the administration and ask to hire another person, right? And they control the money. So it's part of the problem is they're controlling the resources. So as much as possible, trying to find out what those resources are, which at public universities it's easier to find out, and then trying to push in that way is, I think, a good approach. But then also, trying as much as possible to question when the business ethic ends up taking over the academic ethic and pushing against the brands. I think there's going to have to come a point when we decide to tell our universities we're not interested in having so much money and so much attention paid to these brands. But they do it because that's where the money gets generated through, they think, mostly through the athletic systems. The athletic systems are... I mean, if I may tell you one more stupid anecdote. So this tells you how powerful athletics is. The mascot image at Michigan State, where my husband works, is a Spartan head, right? It's the warrior head. And the medical school got an adorable version of that logo, which was the Spartan head with a little stethoscope around it, which we all liked, and it was on the t-shirts and the pins and stuff. Well, the athletic department thought that this suggested that there was concussion danger in athletics. And so, because it was a head with a stethoscope, which might somehow tell people football is dangerous, so the athletics department basically got to tell the medical school, you're not allowed to have that logo. That's how powerful the athletics departments are now. And why? Because the business system is so powerful. Because the corporatization of the universities has meant that athletics is a huge part of the business model. If I really had one thing I could do in universities, like magically, if I were king of the universe, it would be to get rid of athletics. Because I think it would fix a lot of problems. Not least of which is sexual assault charges, right? I said charges.
Hey, so one of the things I've read a lot about in my own time is the increase in academic fraud and the failure of studies, especially in the social sciences, to reproduce. I was just wondering if you thought there was any connection between the increase in academic censorship and the increase in academic fraud, and if so, what sort of connection there might be there. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't think that they're directly connected, but if academic fraud is on the rise, which it appears to be, although it's hard to know if we just are detecting it more, if it is on the rise, it's probably partly because of the pressure to get external funding. When I became a professor 20 years ago, the rule was publish or perish, right? And it was stressful because you had to publish. These days, university systems don't even care about the publications. What they care about is the external funding being brought in because it's the money being brought in. They don't actually, it's weird, they don't actually care about knowledge production. They care about money being brought in to do knowledge production, which is something else entirely. Because it means people like me are useless in the system because the stuff I bring in doesn't bring in any money. I just produce copious amounts of good scholarship. That's meaningless in this system. It was not meaningless 20 years ago. And so part of the reason I think we're seeing fraud is because people feel enormous amounts of pressure to get ever more grants. The standards keep going up, and when that is the case, you find people who are cheating in the system. The good thing is we are catching people. And one of my favorite reading places is Retraction Watch. If you don't know Retraction Watch, you might want to subscribe to it. It's a great online blog that tracks the bad people in academia. It's wonderfully juicy. I actually made Retraction Watch since I got censored, so I count it as having been retracted, so they let me write about it, which was great.
So every election cycle, we're kind of reminded of just how little the average American knows about politics. And you talked about how academia has a responsibility to seek and publish the truth. And I'm wondering if you think that the average American or the average person has a duty to also seek this literature as, what's the purpose of free speech if people don't listen? And what's the purpose of publishing these truths if no one will read the journal?
Yeah, that's a good question. And we certainly are not teaching that as a value, the duty to inquire. I do think of it as a moral duty. In fact, in the book, what I say is I think the pursuit of evidence is the most important moral ethic of our time, that it's the most important thing we need to do is to pursue evidence, because it is the basis for how we know how to treat each other well. And we can't really know how to treat each other well if we don't know what's true about the world. So if we don't know what's true about climate change, or we don't know what's true about rape, or we don't know what's true about sexual sensation, then how can we treat each other well? But you're right, people don't do that. What's happening in this country, because the internet has been so successful, what's happened is that there's been a total gutting of the investigative journalistic system in this country. 20 years ago, when I needed an investigative journalist, it was pretty easy to find one. There were lots of good health investigative journalists and science investigative journalists that I could call. And today, it's very difficult for me to find anybody who can spend any time on a story. I have to basically do all the work myself, which is why I now publish as an investigative journalist sometimes in mainstream places, because I've had to take on that work myself. The consequence of that, what happened was, back in the Watergate days, when people published a really important investigative journalist piece, people literally bought the paper. They went and they bought the paper off the stand and they paid 50 cents or whatever, and that money went back to the newspaper, whether that was the New York Times or the Washington Post or wherever. The money went back to the newspaper and it fed the investigative journalist system. Today, if somebody does a great investigative journalist piece, for example, the LA Times just did an awesome series on the opioid crisis and the corruption that exists behind the opioid crisis in terms of the money from the drug companies. Terrific series. Right away, it's picked up by other places and it's reported at CNN and it's reported at the New York Times, and the money doesn't go back to the LA Times. So there's no money going back into the system to pay for investigative journalism. And as a consequence, what you get is a system where most of what we're getting as news is simply commentary or repeat of what somebody else already said. It's nothing novel, it's nothing new. And this is a huge, huge problem, because it means people aren't actually getting factual information. And there's no system for paying for the development of factual information, for the investigation that goes into it. That is a huge crisis. I was telling Greg that this became so vivid to me as I worked on Galileo's Middle Finger that I realized we had no newspaper in my own town, East Lansing, Michigan, so I started one. So 2 years ago I founded a newspaper, and I spend actually most of my time now running a newspaper and doing government reporting at the local level, which is really weird, right? No, it's just really weird. So like, what was strange was like, when I resigned and made the national news, people were like, wait, you do what now? Because they all think I'm the local government reporter. Anyway, it was funny. So I used to have two lives, where people knew me in East Lansing as this nice lady who was, the woman who would bring your garbage can in, and then they knew me in Chicago and they didn't know I was the same person. It was nice those days.
So you talked about you'd like students to defend faculty more and be more aware of what their faculty are going through. I'm just personally curious, when you were going through all this stuff at Northwestern and when all this was going on, what kind of reaction did you get? I mean, maybe your students didn't know, but like, did you get support from your students at all, or did?
I'm a blabbermouth, so my students all knew what was going on. But they also knew, because I taught one course a year. I taught a history of medicine course in the medical humanities and bioethics program to master's students who were electing to do a master's in medical humanities and bioethics. So they were mostly MD students earning an MD, or they were JD students learning a law degree, or they were genetic counseling students earning a master's in genetic counseling. This was a secondary degree done because they were interested in engaging in medical humanities and bioethics. So they were there because they wanted to be there. And so they were fantastic students. I mean, like the world-class best students. I loved having them. So I hated having to give up teaching. It was really, really, really painful for me to face giving up teaching. And since I knew in the last year that I was probably going to have to resign, that Northwestern probably was not going to do the right thing, I pulled out all the stops and taught the best course I've ever taught, because I thought, if anybody comes after me with a Title IX complaint, it's not going to matter, right? It's not going to matter if I make jokes. Nothing's going to matter. It's like I'm going to be dead tomorrow, so it doesn't matter what I do. So I pulled out all the stops, and I told the students, I'm doing this because I think I won't be here next year because of the censorship. And they engaged, and we had the most phenomenal course. And then we celebrated on the last day. They brought really expensive champagne, and we had a party. We had a great time. But could they go to the administration? I wouldn't let them. And the reason was that I had fellow faculty in the department that I was afraid the dean would basically take hostage and basically fire. And these were people who needed the job, needed the health insurance. So I had to go in part to make sure they were okay. I was stuck in the position that faculty end up stuck in, people like me, between giving up controversial work, which would be difficult for me to do, and constantly being an accidental threat to my colleagues. And I love them. They were my friends and my colleagues, and I didn't want them in that position anymore, so I left to make sure they were safe. They're not safe, of course, because they have a dean who's a jerk, but...
Hi, so you brought up how faculty and professors at universities are kind of living and working in fear of, and kind of trying to pay attention to what they're going through. How do you think we can go about like starting that conversation with our professors? Because I feel like there's a fine line between like, there's concerns of if they'll be comfortable discussing that, or if you kind of just have to like watch it from the outside.
I don't think it's a bad idea for you to go to your professors early in the course during office hours and to say, free speech is one of the things I'm really concerned with, and I know that a lot of people feel that they are in climates of fear, and I just want you to know, I hope you feel like you can push us, because I want to be pushed. And be that counter voice, right? Saying, I want you to trigger me. I want you to push me. Not really trigger in the medical sense, but I want you to push me hard. I want you to give me stuff that challenges me, because that's why I'm here rather than home reading the same darn book I could have read at home, right? I'm here to hear different ideas and to be exposed to things that I never would have thought about before. In my courses, I constantly assign students having to defend various things that they would never in their real lives choose to defend. Right? We always did. I gave them readings that I found disgusting sometimes. I mean, I gave them readings that I told them, I don't agree with this, but I can't quite put my finger on why I don't, so I'm going to give it to you. One time, I gave the students an article. Oh my gosh, I remember this at Michigan State. It was an article about something, and I gave them a reprint of it, and I didn't realize it was a different version of the article that had, I forget what it was, but it had some argument at the end for something that was morally repulsive. It was like for pedophilia or something like that. I think it was for pedophilia. And I was reading it the night before. I was like, oh my God, this is a different version of the article, and it has this repulsive section at the end. And so I went and I was like, oh my God, you guys, I didn't know. And they were like, this was really interesting, Alice. Can we talk about this? They were like, this was really disturbing. And they got totally into it. And we had one of the best, and they made the argument to me that I should continue to teach this piece. But that was, 15 years ago. So I think go in there and be that counter voice and say, I want you to challenge us. I want you to bring in stuff that you're uncomfortable with and we're uncomfortable with, so that we can go and look at the way different people think about different things.
Okay, one last question. What would your advice be to PhD students who want to fight for academic freedom and pursue research interests that are controversial or unlikely to get funding, but also are in the precarious position of trying to enter the academy?
It sounds like you understand the position, right? So it's a difficult, challenging one, and I think what you have to do is make decisions every day based on sort of what's worth it and what's not worth it at that moment, but don't spend your whole life waiting to fight the good fight. Because if you spend your whole life waiting for that, you're never going to end up doing it. I think just try to move forward and be polite and principled and brave, and recognize some people are going to push back at you, but try to do the work anyway. Doing controversial work and getting funding for it can be very difficult, but if you can figure out ways to do your research in ways that don't require as much funding, or that can get other types of sources of funding, sometimes you can do work that's controversial anyway. Most of us in sex research end up getting funding from atypical places, whether that's private foundations or that's funding it ourselves through our salaries. A lot of us do that. There are different ways to do it, but it can be hard, but do it anyway.
So before we go to the reception right over here, I just wanted to thank Alice so much for that awesome talk.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.